The crimson sun bled through the skeletal remains of downtown Chicago's skyline, casting long shadows across streets littered with abandoned cars and the bones of civilization. From the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower, Cassandra Volkov pressed her weathered palm against the reinforced glass, watching the endless sea of undead shuffle through Michigan Avenue like a grotesque parade. Her emerald eyes, once bright with hope, now carried the weight of 3 years surviving in this nightmare world. Below, the infected moved in their eternal dance of hunger, their decomposing bodies creating a carpet of decay that stretched beyond the horizon. Some still wore the tattered remnants of their former lives, business suits, wedding dresses, children's school uniforms, cruel reminders of the world that once was. The stench of death permeated everything, even this high above the chaos, seeping through the building's ventilation system like a persistent ghost. "Cass, they're breaching the eastern barricade again," called Ezekiel Thorne from across the makeshift command center they'd established in what used to be a corporate conference room. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting an unwinnable war for too long. Once a decorated Marine, Ezekiel's broad shoulders now bore scars from countless encounters with the infected, and his dark skin was marked with the pale lines of healed wounds. His military training had kept their small group alive, but even he knew they were living on borrowed time. Cassandra turned from the window, her long auburn hair catching the morning light. She'd been a trauma surgeon before the outbreak, her steady hands saving lives in operating rooms across the city. Now those same hands gripped modified weapons and performed field amputations to prevent infection spread. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her career fighting death, only to find herself in a world where death had already won. How many this time? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Their numbers had been dwindling steadily. What started as a group of 40 survivors had been whittled down to 12 through loss, sacrifice, and the cruel mathematics of survival. At least 300, maybe more. They're attracted to something, moving with more purpose than usual. Ezekiel's weathered hands traced patterns across a makeshift map of the city, marking the infected's movements with red ink that looked disturbingly like blood. "It's like they can sense something we can't." In the corner of the room, Octavia Bellwether sat hunched over a jury-rigged radio system, her fingers dancing across dials and switches with practiced precision. Once a communications engineer for the city's emergency services, she'd become their lifeline to the outside world, or what remained of it. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her blue eyes held the intensity of someone who'd heard too many final transmissions, too many desperate pleas for help that would never come. "I'm picking up chatter from the west," Octavia announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sounds like there's still a pocket of resistance near Navy Pier. They're calling for immediate evacuation assistance." She paused, adjusting her headphones. "Wait, there's something else. Military frequency. They're talking about a final protocol." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone in the room knew what military protocols meant in their new reality. When all else failed, complete sterilization was the only option left. The government had tried it before in smaller cities, turning entire metropolitan areas into radioactive wastelands where nothing, living or dead, could survive. Cassandra felt her heart sink. They'd always known this day might come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that chilled her to the bone. "How long do we have?" "Unknown." The transmission was fragmented, but Octavia's voice trailed off as she continued listening to the static-filled voices. "They mentioned sunset. Something about waiting for optimal conditions." Young Marcus Brennan, barely 21 with sandy hair and freckles that made him look even younger, looked up from where he'd been cleaning weapons. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the constant adrenaline that had kept him alive since losing his entire family in the first wave. "So we're talking about maybe 10 hours? 12 at most." The weight of their situation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. They'd survived 3 years against impossible odds, fought through hordes of infected, lost friends and loved ones, endured starvation, disease and despair. Now it seemed their reward would be vaporization in a nuclear cleansing that would render their struggle meaningless. But Cassandra had seen too much death to simply accept it. Her mind was already working, processing possibilities, calculating odds. She'd performed surgery under gunfire, amputated limbs with nothing but whiskey for anesthesia, and brought people back from the brink of death when everyone else had given up hope. This was just another impossible surgery, another patient on the table with no pulse. "No," she said firmly, surprising everyone including herself. "We don't die here. Not like this." The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Chicago stretched like arteries through the corpse of the city, offering the only route that might bypass the massive horde gathering above ground. Cassandra led their desperate procession through the darkness, her flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The tunnel walls wept with condensation that had long since mixed with less savory fluids, creating a slick, treacherous surface that threatened to send them tumbling into the third rail's embrace. Behind her, the remaining survivors moved like ghosts through the underground maze. Tobias Ashworth, a former librarian whose encyclopedic knowledge of the city's infrastructure had proven invaluable, navigated using pre-outbreak transit maps he'd memorized. His thick glasses were held together with electrical tape, and his once neat beard had grown wild and unkempt. Despite his scholarly appearance, Tobias had proven surprisingly adept with the improvised explosives that had saved their lives more than once. "The blue line should connect us to the harbor district," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "From there, we might be able to reach one of the emergency bunkers the CDC established during the early days of the outbreak." Serafina Valdez, a former paramedic whose quick thinking and medical knowledge complemented Cassandra's surgical skills, helped support Elena Cross, their group's eldest member at 73. Elena had been a high school history teacher before the world ended, and her sharp mind often provided insights that kept them one step ahead of disaster. Now she leaned heavily on Serafina's strong frame, her breathing labored from their rapid descent into the tunnels. "The bunkers were compromised years ago," Elena wheezed, but her voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived through enough history to recognize patterns. "The government abandoned them when they realized the infection couldn't be contained. But there might be supplies, maybe even transportation." A sound echoed from behind them, the distinctive scraping of fingernails against concrete that every survivor knew meant death was following. The infected had found their trail. In the tunnels there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The narrow space that offered concealment from the surface world now became a trap. "Move faster," Ezekiel commanded, taking up the rearguard position with his assault rifle ready. The weapon's worn stock bore notches for every life he'd been forced to take, infected or otherwise. In this new world, sometimes the living were more dangerous than the dead. They're gaining ground. Raven McLeod, a former motorcycle mechanic whose intricate tattoos told the story of a life lived on the edge, carried their precious fuel supplies and the components needed to hotwire any vehicle they might find. Her black hair was streaked with premature silver, and her dark eyes held the hardness of someone who'd learned that sentiment was a luxury the world no longer allowed. She'd lost her daughter in the first wave, and that loss had forged her into something simultaneously fragile and unbreakable. The infected sounds grew closer, accompanied by the wet slapping of decomposing feet against puddled concrete. Cassandra could hear at least a dozen of them, maybe more. In the confined space of the tunnel, their group's advantages in mobility and tactics were negated. Would be a slaughter. "There," Tobias pointed ahead with a trembling finger. "Emergency exit to street level. But we'll be exposed." Through a rusted grate, dim sunlight filtered down, offering hope and terror in equal measure. Above ground meant potential escape routes, but it also meant the massive horde that had been gathering all morning. The infected seemed to be moving with unprecedented coordination, as if responding to some signal only they could perceive. As they climbed toward the surface, the sounds of their pursuers filled the tunnel behind them. Cassandra could hear the infected bumping into walls, their deteriorated motor functions making them clumsy but no less dangerous. Their hunger was eternal, their patience infinite. Dmitry Volkov, Cassandra's younger brother and the group's primary scout, had already reached the grate and was working to remove the rusted bolts. His lean frame belied a strength born of desperation, and his blue eyes, so like his sister's, constantly scanned for threats. He'd been a college student when the world ended, studying architecture with dreams of designing buildings that would stand for centuries. Now he specialized in finding ways through buildings that were already falling apart. "The street's relatively clear," he reported in a hushed voice. "But there's something wrong with the infected up there. They're not behaving normally." Through the grate, they could see the creatures milling about with an almost human-like purposefulness. Some appeared to be waiting, as if listening for instructions. Others moved in formations that suggested a level of organization that chilled everyone who witnessed it. "They're evolving," whispered Dr. Nolan Pierce, their newest member and a virologist who joined them only weeks before. His expertise in infectious diseases had been both a blessing and a curse. He understood their enemy better than anyone, but that knowledge came with the terrible certainty that humanity was fighting a war it couldn't win. The virus is adapting, learning. What we're seeing isn't random anymore. The implications of his words settled over the group like a death shroud. They weren't just fighting mindless corpses anymore, They were up against something that was becoming smarter, more organized, more dangerous with every passing day. As the infected closed in from below and an uncertain fate waited above, Cassandra realized they were trapped between the devils they knew and the ones they didn't. The nuclear sterilization suddenly seemed less like destruction and more like mercy. The Chicago streets at midday had become a cathedral of destruction, with abandoned skyscrapers serving as monuments to humanity's lost civilization. Cassandra's group emerged from the subway like refugees from the underworld, only to find themselves in a nightmare that defied comprehension. The infected weren't simply wandering anymore, they moved in coordinated groups, some taking positions at strategic locations while others seemed to be actively hunting with a terrifying intelligence. Valencia Restrepo, their group's youngest member at 19, clutched a modified crossbow with hands that had grown steady through necessity. She'd been a dance student before the outbreak, her body trained for grace and precision. Those same qualities now made her their most effective silent killer, able to take down infected without alerting others to their presence. Her dark eyes, which once sparkled with artistic ambition, now held the cold calculation of a predator. "They're hurting us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the groaning of settling debris. "Look at their positions. They're forcing us toward something." She was right. As Cassandra studied the infected's movements, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. These weren't random congregations, they were deliberate formations designed to funnel any survivors toward a specific destination. The virus hadn't just reanimated corpses, it had created a collective intelligence that was learning to hunt more effectively. Dr. Pierce knelt beside a recently infected corpse, studying its condition with the detached fascination of a scientist even as time ran critically short. "The neural pathways are still active," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "The virus isn't destroying the brain, it's rewiring it, creating new connections. They're not just infected anymore, they're networked." The implications were staggering. If the infected could share information, coordinate attacks, and learn from their encounters with survivors, then every human alive was living on borrowed time. The nuclear sterilization wasn't just about destroying the infected, it was about preventing this new form of life from spreading beyond the quarantine zones. Augustus Romano, a former federal marshal whose law enforcement experience had been invaluable in their survival, scanned the surrounding buildings through his rifle scope. His weathered face bore the scars of a man who'd upheld justice in a world where justice had become meaningless. "Multiple contacts moving through the Millennium Park area," he reported grimly. "Estimate 2,000 plus, all moving with purpose." The numbers were overwhelming. Even with their combined skills and experience, 12 people couldn't fight their way through that many infected. They needed a different strategy, something that would allow them to reach the harbor district and potentially escape the city before the military's final protocol was implemented. Cassandra's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. They could try to circle around the main concentration of infected, but that would take time they didn't have. They could attempt to fight their way through, but that would be suicide. Or they could do something so insane that it might actually work. "The Willis Tower," she said suddenly, causing everyone to turn toward her with expressions of confusion and concern. "We go back up." "That's madness," Ezekiel protested. "We just left there because it was compromised." "Exactly. The infected breached the eastern barricade, which means they're inside the building now. But they're also down here on the streets, which means the upper floors might be clear again." Cassandra's surgical mind dissected the problem with clinical precision. "If we can reach the roof, we might be able to signal for emergency evacuation before the sterilization begins." It was a long shot bordering on fantasy. But in a world where the dead walked and the living were vastly outnumbered, long shots were often the only shots available. The group began moving with desperate urgency, using abandoned vehicles and collapsed storefronts for cover as they navigated back toward the Willis Tower. Every shadow could hide death, every sound could signal their discovery. The infected seemed to sense their movement, shifting positions like pieces on a vast chessboard. As they approached the tower's base, the scale of the destruction became apparent. The ground floor had been completely overrun, with infected pouring in and out of shattered windows and doors. But Cassandra's theory proved correct. The sheer number of infected at street level suggested that the upper floors had been temporarily abandoned as the creatures followed their collective instinct to hunt at ground level. There, Dmitri pointed to a maintenance access on the building's north side. "Emergency stairwell. If we can reach it without being seen." The distance was maybe 50 yards, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Between their position and safety lay an open plaza filled with infected that moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. One wrong step, one sound at the wrong moment, and they would face a death that would make nuclear sterilization seem merciful. Valencia nocked an arrow in her crossbow, her dancer's grace evident even in this moment of terror. "I can clear a path," she whispered. "Silent kills create a corridor." It was their only chance. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, marking time until their potential annihilation, 12 survivors prepared to bet their lives on a plan that defied logic and embraced desperation. The final battle for survival was about to begin, and the odds had never been worse. The maintenance stairwell of the Willis Tower had become a vertical tomb, each landing marked by evidence of humanity's final struggle. Cassandra led their desperate ascent through a maze of corpses and debris, her surgical training allowing her to navigate the carnage with clinical detachment while her heart screamed at the horror surrounding them. Valencia's silent arrows had indeed cleared their initial path, but now they faced a different kind of enemy, the infected that had been trapped inside the tower when the main horde moved to street level. 43 floors up, they encountered their first significant resistance. A group of infected in business attire, former office workers who'd been transformed in the middle of what might have been an ordinary Tuesday meeting, blocked the stairwell. Their condition was particularly disturbing because they moved with an eerie synchronization, turning their heads as one unit when the survivors appeared, opening their mouths in unison to release the distinctive moan that would alert others to fresh prey. Ezekiel raised his rifle, but Cassandra stopped him with a gesture. Gunfire would echo through the building's steel and concrete structure, potentially drawing every infected creature for miles. Instead, she drew the surgical knife she'd modified into a weapon, its familiar weight reassuring in her steady hands. The battle was brief but vicious. Serafina and Valencia flanked the group while Tobias used his knowledge of human anatomy, gleaned from years of reading medical texts, to guide their strikes to the most vulnerable points. The infected fell quickly, but not before one managed to rake its decomposing fingernails across Elena's forearm, drawing blood and raising the specter of infection that haunted every survivor's nightmares. "It's superficial," Cassandra assessed quickly, examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "But we need to clean and bandage it immediately." Elena's weathered face remained stoic, but her eyes held the fear they all carried, not of death, but of becoming something that would hunt their friends and family. "Just keep moving," she insisted. "We can't afford to stop now." Dr. Pierce produced a small vial of antiseptic from their dwindling medical supplies, his hands shaking slightly as he helped treat Elena's wound. His knowledge of the virus made him acutely aware of infection vectors and incubation periods. "If the virus is present, we'll know within hours," he said quietly. "But based on the wound pattern and depth, I believe you're safe." As they continued their climb, the building told its story through abandoned offices and meeting rooms. Augustus Romano, ever vigilant, spotted movement through an office window, infected trapped behind glass doors, unable to comprehend the barrier that kept them from reaching potential prey. Their faces pressed against the transparent walls, leaving smears of decay that looked like abstract art created by madness itself. 58th floor, Dmitri reported, checking his handwritten notes against the building directory. "We're making good time, but the afternoon is getting away from us." Through the stairwell windows, they could see the sun beginning its inexorable descent toward the horizon. Each passing minute brought them closer to the military's final protocol, and closer to a decision that would erase Chicago from the map. The weight of that knowledge drove them upward, their legs burning with exhaustion but their determination unbroken. Raven McLeod, carrying their fuel supplies and mechanical equipment, paused at a landing to catch her breath. Her tattooed arms glistened with sweat, and her breathing came in short gasps that spoke of someone pushed beyond normal human endurance. "The radio chatter is getting stronger," she reported, holding up a small handheld device she'd been monitoring. "Military frequencies are active. They're coordinating something big." The words confirmed what they all suspected but feared to voice. Time was running out faster than they'd hoped. Whatever window of opportunity existed for escape or rescue was closing rapidly, measured in hours rather than days. On the 70th floor they encountered something that stopped them cold. The stairwell opened onto a floor where someone had attempted to create a survivor's stronghold. Barricades made from office furniture blocked doorways, and hand-painted signs provided warnings about infected movements and safe zones. But the stronghold had been overrun, its defenders either dead or transformed. What made the scene particularly disturbing was the evidence of organization among the attacking infected. They hadn't simply overwhelmed the defenses through numbers, they'd systematically dismantled the barricades in a way that suggested planning and coordination. Tools lay scattered about, some showing signs of use by hands that no longer possessed human intelligence but retained muscle memory from their former lives. Their problem-solving, Dr. Pierce observed with scientific fascination mixed with horror. The virus isn't just preserving motor functions, it's enhancing cognitive abilities in specific areas related to hunting and survival. Valencia discovered something even more disturbing in one of the abandoned offices. A wall covered with what appeared to be a map of the city, marked with symbols and patterns that suggested the infected were tracking human movement and adapting their hunting strategies accordingly. We're not just fighting for our lives, Cassandra realized with growing dread. We're fighting against an enemy that's learning from every encounter, becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The implications were staggering. If the infected could plan, coordinate, and adapt, then traditional survival strategies were not just inadequate, they were potentially counterproductive. Every move the survivors made was being observed, analyzed, and countered by an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. As they resumed their climb toward the tower's summit, each step carried them higher above the city and deeper into uncertainty. The final battle for survival had evolved beyond simple combat. It had become a contest between human ingenuity and viral evolution, with the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. The Willis Tower's upper floors had become a monument to corporate ambition frozen in time, each abandoned office a snapshot of the moment when civilization ground to a halt. Cassandra's group finally reached the communications center they'd established on the 82nd floor, only to find their equipment partially destroyed by infected who had somehow managed to operate with sufficient coordination to target their most vital systems. Octavia Bellwether worked frantically to repair their radio array, her engineer's hands moving with desperate precision as she rewired connections and bypassed damaged components. Sparks flew from exposed circuits, casting eerie shadows on walls that bore the claw marks of inhuman hands. Most of the primary systems are intact, she reported breathlessly. But they specifically targeted our transmission capabilities. It's like they knew exactly what would hurt us most. The deliberate nature of the sabotage sent chills through the entire group. The infected weren't just problem-solving anymore, they were engaging in psychological warfare, understanding that cutting off communication was more damaging than physical assault. It suggested a level of strategic thinking that redefined everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Through the tower's windows, the late afternoon sun painted Chicago in shades of amber and blood. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast necropolis where millions of infected continued their eternal hunt for the living. But there were also signs of life, smoke rising from distant buildings, the occasional flash of light that might be a mirror signal, evidence that other survivors were still fighting their own desperate battles. Dr. Pierce had commandeered a corner of the communications center to analyze samples he'd collected from the infected they'd encountered. His makeshift laboratory consisted of a microscope salvaged from a medical building and chemical testing kits that represented humanity's last attempt to understand its destroyer. The viral structure is unlike anything in our medical literature, he announced grimly. It's not just adapting to human biology, it's improving upon it. Valencia stood guard at the eastern windows, her crossbow ready as she watched for signs of infected ascending the building. Her dancer's training had given her an almost supernatural awareness of movement and rhythm, skills that translated surprisingly well to detecting threats in their current environment. Movement on floor 76, she reported. They're climbing again. The infected's ability to navigate the tower's complex layout demonstrated not just intelligence but memory. They remembered the building's structure from their human lives and were using that knowledge to hunt more effectively. Every advantage humanity once possessed was being systematically eliminated by their own reanimated past. Ezekiel coordinated their defenses while simultaneously helping Octavia with the radio repairs. His military experience in urban warfare proved invaluable as he identified choke points and established firing positions that would maximize their effectiveness against superior numbers. We can hold them off for maybe an hour, he assessed grimly. After that, we'll be overrun. Through the static-filled radio, fragments of communication began to emerge. Military units coordinating evacuation procedures, civilian survivors pleading for assistance, and something else, transmissions that didn't sound entirely human. The infected were using radio equipment, broadcasting sounds that resembled language but followed no human linguistic patterns. They're communicating, Octavia realized with growing horror. Not just with each other locally but across the entire city. Maybe even beyond. The implications were staggering. If the infected had developed their own communication network, they could coordinate attacks on a massive scale, share information about survivor locations, and potentially even spread their collective intelligence to other infected populations worldwide. Humanity wasn't just fighting a local outbreak, they were confronting the birth of a new form of life that was more adaptable and potentially more intelligent than its creators. Raven McLeod worked on preparing emergency transportation, a helicopter they'd spotted on the building's roof that might still be functional if she could hotwire its systems. Her mechanical expertise, developed through years of working on complex engines, was their only hope of escaping the tower before either the infected or the military's final protocol eliminated all alternatives. "Engine's in decent shape," she reported from the roof access. "But fuel's going to be a problem. We've got maybe 20 minutes of flight time, assuming I can get it started at all." 20 minutes wasn't enough to reach the harbor district, let alone escape the city entirely. But it might be enough to reach another survivor group, or to find a secure location where they could wait out the sterilization and emerge into whatever world remained afterward. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Augustus Romano monitored military frequencies with growing concern. The transmissions were becoming more urgent, with repeated references to final authorization and cleansing protocols. Time was running out faster than they'd feared, measured now in minutes rather than hours. "They're moving up the timeline," he announced grimly. Something spooked them badly. "The sterilization isn't scheduled for sunset anymore, it's coming at 1700 hours. Cassandra checked her watch with hands that trembled despite her surgical training. It was already 4:30. They had 30 minutes to implement a miracle or face annihilation alongside the infected they'd spent 3 years fighting. The final battle for survival had become a race against time where every second counted and every decision carried the weight of species extinction. In the distance, the sound of aircraft engines began to echo across the city, growing steadily louder as humanity prepared to erase its greatest failure from the face of the earth. The sound of approaching military aircraft filled the air like thunder, each engine note marking another step closer to humanity's final gambit. From the Willis Tower's roof, Cassandra could see the formation approaching from the south, bombers carrying payloads that would reduce Chicago to radioactive ash within minutes of deployment. The infected below seemed to sense the approaching danger, their movements becoming more frantic and coordinated as if they too understood that time was running out. Raven McLeod's hands moved with desperate precision across the helicopter's control panel, her mechanical expertise the only thing standing between the group and certain death. Sparks flew from exposed wiring as she bypassed security systems and hotwired the aircraft's starting mechanisms. "Almost got it," she muttered through gritted teeth. "Just need another minute." A minute they might not have. Through the roof access door, the sounds of approaching infected grew louder, dozens of them ascending the tower's stairwells with the relentless determination of creatures that felt neither pain nor fatigue. Ezekiel and Augustus had established a defensive perimeter around the roof access, their weapons trained on doorways that would soon become gateways to hell. Movement on the south stairwell, Valencia reported from her sniper position. Her crossbow was loaded with one of their few remaining explosive-tipped arrows, designed to take out multiple targets in the confined space of the stairwell. At least 20 contacts, moving fast. Dimitri worked alongside Dr. Pierce to load their essential supplies into the helicopter. Medical equipment, research samples, and the communication gear they'd managed to salvage. Every item represented a choice between necessity and sentimentality, between survival and humanity. They were leaving behind 3 years of accumulated knowledge and resources, carrying only what might help them survive in whatever world emerged from the nuclear fire. The radio crackled with final transmissions from around the city. Other survivor groups making their last desperate pleas for evacuation, military units confirming target coordinates, and something else. The infected strange pseudo-language had evolved into something that almost resembled human speech. They were trying to communicate with the outside world, perhaps attempting to negotiate or plead for their existence. "They know," Dr. Pierce realized with scientific fascination mixed with horror. "They understand what's about to happen. The collective intelligence has reached a level where they can comprehend abstract concepts like nuclear sterilization." Elena Cross, despite her age and the wound on her arm, worked to secure loose equipment that could become projectiles during their escape attempt. Her history teacher's mind processed the significance of what they were witnessing, the potential extinction of one form of life and the birth of another, played out against the backdrop of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. "In all of human history," she observed with academic detachment, "we've never faced an enemy that could evolve faster than we could adapt. We're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting against obsolescence." The helicopter's engine suddenly roared to life, its rotors beginning their slow rotation as Raven's mechanical wizardry overcame 3 years of neglect and decay. But the sound also acted like a dinner bell for the infected, their moans and screams echoing up from the stairwells as they realized their prey was attempting to escape. Go, go, go! Ezekiel shouted over the engine noise, providing covering fire as infected began pouring onto the roof from multiple access points. The creatures moved with coordinated precision, some attempting to flank the helicopter while others made direct assaults on the defensive perimeter. Serafina helped Elena into the aircraft while Tobias loaded the last of their supplies. His encyclopedic knowledge of the city's layout would be crucial for navigating to any potential safe zones, assuming they could survive the next few minutes. The helicopter could carry 8 people maximum, which meant 4 members of their group would have to stay behind. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. Cassandra found herself in the impossible position of choosing who would live and who would die, a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed as a surgeon. Her oath had been to preserve life, not to decide whose life was worth preserving. "I'm staying," Augustus announced, his rifle cutting down infected as they attempted to reach the helicopter. "Someone needs to buy you time to get airborne." "We're all going," Cassandra insisted, but even as she spoke, she knew it was impossible. The helicopter was already overloaded, and more infected were streaming onto the roof with each passing second. Valencia made the choice for them, stepping away from the helicopter and taking position alongside Augustus. "I can clear more of them with the crossbow," she said simply. "And I'm fast enough to maybe find another way down." The lie was obvious to everyone, but it carried the weight of sacrifice that made survival possible for the others. Ezekiel and Dimitri also moved to defensive positions, their weapons creating a perimeter that would hold for perhaps 2 minutes, long enough for the helicopter to achieve takeoff and escape the tower's airspace. As the rotors reached full speed, Cassandra found herself making the most difficult decision of her life, accepting the sacrifice of others to preserve the possibility of human survival. The helicopter lifted off just as military aircraft began their final approach, their bomb bay doors opening to reveal payloads that would end 3 years of nightmare and quite possibly any chance of human recovery. Below them, Chicago burned with the flames of the infected's rage and humanity's failure, while above them, the sky filled with the promise of nuclear fire that would purify the earth of both the living and the dead. The helicopter lurched through turbulent air as shock waves from the first nuclear detonation rippled across the Chicago skyline. Behind them, the Willis Tower disappeared in a column of superheated plasma that transformed steel and concrete into vapor in milliseconds. Cassandra gripped the co-pilot's seat, watching through tears as the city where she'd saved countless lives became a monument to humanity's ultimate failure. Raven McLeod fought to maintain control of the aircraft as electromagnetic pulses from the detonation interfered with their navigation systems. Her knuckles were white against the control stick, her tattooed arms straining against forces that threatened to tear the helicopter apart. "We're losing altitude," she announced through gritted teeth. "The blast's affecting our engine performance." Below them, the infected masses that had ruled Chicago streets for 3 years were being consumed by nuclear fire that showed no distinction between the living and the dead. The creatures' final moments were lost in light that outshone the sun, their collective intelligence extinguished along with every trace of the city they'd claimed as their hunting ground. Dr. Pierce monitored their remaining medical equipment while simultaneously tracking radiation levels with a Geiger counter salvaged from a hospital. The clicking sound grew more frequent as radioactive particles began settling around them, creating an invisible shroud of death that would contaminate the region for generations. "We need to get at least 50 miles from ground zero," he announced grimly. "And even then our long-term survival prospects are." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. They'd escaped immediate annihilation only to face slower death from radiation poisoning, assuming they could find anywhere safe to land before their fuel ran out. Octavia worked frantically with their portable radio equipment, scanning frequencies for any signs of other survivors or safe zones beyond the sterilization perimeter. Static filled most channels, but occasionally voices broke through, military units coordinating additional strikes, civilian populations fleeing contaminated areas, and something else that made her blood run cold. "I'm picking up transmissions from Milwaukee," she reported with growing dread. "Similar to the organized communication patterns we heard from the infected in Chicago. The virus, it's already spread beyond the quarantine zone." The words hit the survivors like a physical blow. Their sacrifice, their friends' deaths, the nuclear destruction of an entire city, none of it had contained the infection. The collective intelligence they'd witnessed wasn't limited to Chicago. It had become a network spanning multiple cities, perhaps the entire continent. Elena Cross, despite her age and injuries, maintained her composure with the dignity of someone who'd taught history long enough to recognize patterns of civilizational collapse. "We're witnessing the end of the human era," she observed with academic detachment that masked profound grief. Not with a whimper, but with the birth of something that might be better adapted to survive. Through the helicopter's windows, they could see other aircraft fleeing the destruction. Military transports, civilian planes, and helicopters like their own carrying the last remnants of human resistance. Some were already falling from the sky, their engines failing as electromagnetic radiation fried delicate electronic systems. The fuel gauge showed less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly before them, its dark waters offering no sanctuary for a helicopter that couldn't reach the opposite shore. Raven scanned the shoreline desperately, looking for any flat surface that might serve as a landing zone before their engine died completely. There, Dmitri pointed toward a small island maybe 5 miles offshore. "Looks uninhabited. If we can reach it." It was their only option. Raven adjusted course toward the island, the helicopter's engine coughing as fuel lines began to starve. Behind them, additional nuclear detonations lit the horizon as the military sterilization protocol expanded to encompass the entire Great Lakes region. Each flash represented millions of lives, both human and infected, being erased from existence. Serafina worked to prepare their emergency medical supplies for whatever awaited them on the island. Her paramedic training had taught her to expect the unexpected, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for performing triage in the aftermath of nuclear war. "Elena's wound is showing signs of infection," she reported quietly. "Not viral, bacterial. But without proper antibiotics." The implication hung heavy in the recycled air of the helicopter's cabin. They'd survived 3 years of zombie apocalypse, escaped nuclear annihilation and reached temporary safety, only to potentially lose one of their own to something as mundane as an infected cut. As they approached the island, its features became clearer: rocky shores, dense forest coverage, and what appeared to be the ruins of an old lighthouse on the northern point. It looked uninhabited, which meant it might also be uncontaminated. But appearances could be deceiving in their new reality. The helicopter touched down on a small beach just as its engine seized completely, rotors spinning to a stop with mechanical finality. They'd made it to relative safety, but they were now stranded with limited supplies and no means of further evacuation. The island would either be their salvation or their tomb. Tobias immediately began surveying their new environment with the methodical approach of a librarian cataloging resources. "The lighthouse might have communication equipment," he suggested hopefully. "And there could be supplies left by previous inhabitants." But as they unloaded their equipment and began exploring the island, they discovered they weren't alone. Fresh footprints in the sand led toward the lighthouse, and smoke rising from the building's chimney indicated recent human activity. Whether that presence represented salvation or another threat remained to be determined. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the radioactive clouds on the horizon in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful in any other context. As darkness approached, they would have to decide whether to make contact with the island's other inhabitants or remain hidden until they could assess the situation more thoroughly. In the distance, the glow of burning cities created an artificial dawn that would last for days, marking the end of one chapter in human history and the uncertain beginning of whatever came next. 3 months had passed since the Great Sterilization, as the survivors had come to call the nuclear cleansing that erased 15 major metropolitan areas from the map. The lighthouse on Beaver Island had indeed sheltered other survivors, a family of scientists who'd been studying lake ecology when the outbreak began. Together, they'd created a small community of 14 souls trying to rebuild some semblance of civilization on their isolated refuge. Cassandra stood at the lighthouse's observation deck, watching the sunrise paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold that seemed almost obscene after everything they'd witnessed. The radiation levels had dropped to barely detectable ranges, and fish were returning to the lake's waters. Nature, it seemed, was more resilient than the civilizations that had tried to dominate it. Below, their small community went about the business of survival with quiet determination. Raven had established a workshop in the lighthouse's lower levels, using salvaged materials to build wind generators and water purification systems. Her mechanical expertise had become the foundation of their technological infrastructure, each device a small victory against the forces of entropy. Dr. Pierce worked in a makeshift laboratory, continuing his research into the virus that had destroyed their world. His findings were disturbing but illuminating. the infected hadn't been destroyed by the nuclear sterilization. They'd evolved, adapting to radiation levels that should have been lethal. Satellite imagery from uncontaminated regions showed infected populations not just surviving, but thriving in the radioactive wastelands that had once been America's greatest cities. They're not just immune to radiation, he reported during their weekly community meetings. They're actually being enhanced by it. The virus is using gamma radiation as an energy source, making them stronger and more intelligent. The implications were staggering. Humanity's final gambit hadn't destroyed their enemy, it had inadvertently created the perfect environment for their evolution. The infected now ruled a continent-sized wasteland where they could develop their collective intelligence without human interference. Octavia maintained their radio watch, monitoring transmissions from around the world. The news was uniformly grim. The infection had spread globally despite quarantine efforts, and similar sterilization protocols had been implemented on every continent. Australia had gone silent completely. Europe reported coordinated infected attacks on major population centers. Asia's great cities burned with nuclear fire as governments chose annihilation over surrender. Elena Cross had established a school of sorts, teaching the few children in their community about the world that had been lost. Her history lessons carried new weight when every story was about a civilization that no longer existed. She'd aged visibly in their months on the island, the wound from their escape never quite healing properly despite Serafina's skilled care. "We're not just survivors," Elena told her students during one particularly somber lesson. "We're witnesses. It's our responsibility to remember not just what humanity achieved, but what we became in the end." Valencia had adapted to island life with surprising ease, her dancer's grace finding new expression in navigating the rocky shoreline and dense forest that covered their refuge. She'd become their primary scout and hunter, using skills developed in the urban wasteland to secure food and monitor for potential threats. But her eyes still held the hardness of someone who'd seen too much death too young. The island's original inhabitants, Dr. Marcus Chin, a marine biologist, his wife Dr. Sarah Chin, a geneticist, and their teenage daughter Amy, had integrated seamlessly with the Chicago survivors. Their scientific expertise complemented the street-smart survival skills of Cassandra's group, creating a community that was both intellectually robust and practically capable. But their isolation came with a cost. They were 14 people trying to preserve human civilization while the rest of the world burned. Their gene pool was too small for long-term survival, their resources too limited for significant expansion. They were a museum of humanity, carefully preserved but ultimately finite. As summer turned to autumn, disturbing reports began filtering through their radio equipment. The infected weren't content to rule the radioactive wastelands, they were building. Satellite images showed massive construction projects in the ruins of major cities, structures that defied conventional understanding of infected behavior. They weren't just surviving, they were creating their own civilization. "They're not zombies anymore," Dr. Chin observed during one of their evening discussions. "They've become something new. Something that might be what evolution looks like when it's accelerated by technology and necessity." The question that haunted them all was whether humanity's future lay in hiding on isolated islands like prehistoric holdouts, or in somehow learning to coexist with the intelligence that had inherited their world. Some nights, when the northern lights danced across the sky with colors that hadn't existed before the sterilization, Cassandra wondered if they were the last chapter of human history or the first chapter of something entirely new. In the lighthouse's beam, which they still operated each night, she saw both a beacon of hope for other survivors and a memorial to the species that had built it. The light swept across dark waters that might hide salvation or destruction, carrying their story into a night that had no guaranteed dawn. The final battle for survival hadn't been won or lost, it had evolved into something far more complex and uncertain. In their small community of 14 souls, the future of human consciousness flickered like a flame in the wind, precious and fragile and desperately determined to survive until morning came again.